All of us at some point in our lives, grief and loss. Shock, sadness, emptiness, loneliness, tears are some of the words you can use to describe this emotion. Grief is a journey, not a destination, we're told. Whether it's the loss of a loved one, a relationship, or a cherished dream, grief can feel like an insurmountable wave threatening to pull the one it affects under. We seek to hear from individuals who have faced the depths of loss and emerged with stories of resilience and hope, and explore the many faces of grief, how it transforms us, and how we can navigate its tumultuous waters to find healing and solace. Justice Wanjiku, here's a glimpse into the many faces of grief. Well, Your Honor, grief indeed can feel like an uncharted landscape, a place where the familiar seems distant and the path forward uncertain. And because we grieve differently, all of us, and in our own terms, this court would like to call to the stand Shirley Waini to share her experience. Thanks, Shirley. Just start by sharing us your experience with loss and grief.
I can say my first experience with grief was actually losing my grandmother. When I was younger, before my parents, found their footing and were stable in Nairobi, they took me to live with my grandma. And I stayed with my grandma and I was able to bond with her. And some years back, she passed away. And at the time that she was passing away, we hadn't spent a lot of time together. It happened while I was still in school. Sad bit about it is that I didn't know that I was grieving until much more recently. My second experience with grief was actually loss of relationships that I thought were dear to me, or that still I consider were very dear to me. The first was I had an aunt who was in our family. We grew up together with her. But as life went on, she suddenly stopped talking to us. She just put us on the side. And this is someone in my mind I had hoped would be my best friend forever. I considered her to be my best friend, or like my sister forever. My next loss or grief that I consider to have been significant in my life was actually a career loss. An experience that happened within 1 or 2 years actually meant that whatever trajectory I thought my career would take, the kind of job I thought I would get, it didn't happen. And I had to learn how to deal with that. So for a long time, I did not deal with my grief. My life was stuck.
What would you say? Let's just take, for instance, the loss of your grandmother, who was very close to you. How did that impact your life?
At that time I was in high school, so that all that was happening while I was in high school. I hadn't seen her physically for like 3 years. So at the time she was going, the bond that we had created with her, the stories she'd give, the expectation that she would be there to actually see my life, celebrate happy moments with me, that she would not be able to do all that. That's one. And number two, that she died in pain.
What kind of feelings did you have, and how were you able to navigate through these emotions?
So it's a feeling of regret. It's a feeling of a lot of sadness. And then there's a lot of, I wish I had said this, I wish I had done this, I wish I had done this way. And
then when you talk about the loss of a relationship with your auntie, what emotion did that bring with it?
It's disappointment, wondering what did I do, because the situation that led her to, distance herself from me had nothing to do with me. She also had children. She still has children. These were my cousins. We had bonded. I'd brought some of them up. Then now we're not talking at all.
What would you say, to what extent did it impact your mental well-being?
I felt inadequate. I felt disappointed. I felt most of the time that I wanted to just be by myself. And what I realized before someone actually called me and called me out of it and told me you're grieving and you're, there's something that is happening in your life that you need to deal with. I had spent a lot of time by myself, just staying indoors. I'm afraid of people asking me, what are you doing with your life? Because at that time, the answer was nothing. Well, that period happened to coincide with the COVID period. So for some time, people didn't realize there was anything wrong because we were all at home. But then after that, as people are coming out and continuing with their lives, I'm still stuck.
Did you seek professional support and counseling through your grieving process?
The worst part of my grief was that I didn't know that I was grieving. So I didn't imagine that I needed to get help from anybody. I was living on the mantras of, when the going gets tough, the tough get going, or these ones that people in the religious spaces say you need to encourage yourself in the Lord, or you need to take heart and all those. But for grief, you have to deal with it. It was actually my mom who insisted that I needed to get help. So I did seek help much more recently, and that's why I'm saying once you learn that you need to deal with grief and do it professionally, it gets much, much easier. And through that process, I was actually able to discover that my life had a lot of grief that needed to be dealt with for me to be okay and for me to get unstuck.
Justice Wanjiku, to understanding how to care for oneself during the grieving process is crucial for healing. But what constitutes a normal grieving process, and when does grieving become depression? This court now calls to the stand Rose Gishure. Thanks, Rose. How would you personally define grief? And then take us through your journey of loss and grief.
So I define grief as feelings of sadness and sorrow about something that you have lost, and this something or someone is something that you loved. Yeah. So yes, we tend to associate grief with the loss of a person, a human being, but the truth is that we do grieve other things. I have lost, and I think this is what counselors call cumulative grief, where you lose one person after another after another. So I have lost my two parents, my mom and my dad, and I've also lost my two brothers. And when I tell people that, they tend to think it was an accident that took all of them away. But no, each of these four people have died in their own time.
At some point you realize that, something is amiss, that you're not okay.
Yeah.
How did you come to that realization?
When my brother died in 2011, this is maybe like almost 10 years after my dad, that was the first time I remember feeling extremely sad. So when my brother died and he was 2 years younger than me, I'm like, wait a minute, younger people also die. That then sent me into, I'd say, depression. I was in campus at the time, and maybe even unhealthy coping skills now that I know better, because then at least for me, I drank myself silly.
There is an unspoken expectation in society that when you experience grief, that, at some point you move on, like time heals.
Yeah.
But this is not an entirely true statement.
It's not true. And I think today's society is beginning to realize that. We have heard of the stages of grief that people like to use a lot, from anger and shock and denial, all the way to bargaining, all the way to acceptance. So when society expects you to get to acceptance quickly and you're not getting there, then already, for somebody who's already very broken in that, you're already feeling the pressure of society to get out of this thing. Some people may have better coping skills than you, and then you begin to compare yourself with them. For me, I have come to realize that when you say a stage of grief, you kind of almost expect that a stage has a beginning and an end. I think the correct word should even be cycles of grief, because the cycle seems continuous. So the anger will come, and then you also go into denial. Then you maybe even go into, accepting that this person is no longer there. But the next month, maybe you're angry again, and that's also very okay, as long as you're dealing with your grief. And that's the truth. You cannot run away from it. Grief is, I know, yes, I said it's a feelings of sadness, but grief actually is the love that you had for that person that now has nowhere to go. That love is what becomes grief, and it's looking for a place to go. Grief will always take some form of if you don't define it yourself, it will define itself for you.
What are some of the methods that you would advise?
One, it's to accept that this thing is bigger than you, and you'll have to go through it. But it won't swallow you unless you allow it, right? So you're stronger than it also. You can deal with it. Also, remove any feelings of shame and comparison. So don't feel ashamed that you're drinking yourself silly. Don't feel ashamed that you haven't even showered in 3 days. All these unhealthy coping mechanisms might have worked for a short while in the beginning, but they're not long-term. So you need to sort of arm yourself or equip yourself with long-term coping skills. Like, for example, I always see people get into some form of exercise. The other thing I advise people to do is to actually sit with their feelings. So when the feelings of grief do come your way, don't run away from them. Ask yourself, and even take a journal and start writing and saying, why am I feeling this? Why am I angry? Who am I angry at? Am I angry at God? Why am I angry at God? So you go down that chain of thinking until you uncover why you're angry.
Someone will tell you, we were supposed to do this.
Yeah.
Like, there's no closure. We were supposed to go and make something happen. We're supposed to have this discussion.
Yeah.
So it sits with them.
Yeah.
How do you start addressing it?
So I advise people to write letters. I always ask people to write letters to even grief itself, but also write a letter to the person that you've lost. And it's something you could pick up as an activity that you do on their anniversary, the death anniversary. Yeah. So write them a letter, tell them how you're feeling. And year in, year out, you realize that the tone of the letter begins to change. An update of life. Yeah. Sometimes you'll even realize things about the person who's died after they've died, and things will shock you when you hear he was doing what, he had done what. For spouses, for example, maybe the husband had sold the shamba and you don't even know, yeah, as a spouse. So sit with those feelings, talk to that person, go to their grave if you must. Sometimes it feels very un-African to go to the grave after we've finished, to go back there. But go back there, take flowers, talk to them, tell them how you're feeling, tell them how they made you feel. But then begin to forgive them and forgive yourself also for being angry at them.
Would you think professional help is important?
Of course. Of course. It's like being unwell and you have to go to the doctor. If we didn't have doctors, then what would be the point of that? Yeah. So this is something that nobody teaches you about. So you cannot try to go at it alone.
All right. And finally, if there's someone who would like to share, just hear experiences of those who are experiencing grief, you have a podcast?
Yes, I do run a podcast called Grief Angels Podcast. We are on YouTube and Spotify. We're also on Instagram. We've been able to build a community of over 3,000 people in about a year and a half. And that tells you that there's need for a lot of grief awareness and grief support.
Well, those are invaluable insights, Justice Wanjiku. And further, this court would like to navigate through the process and the journey of healing. The court now calls upon Josephine Kiluta to the stand. Thank you, Josephine. Maybe also share with us your experience with grief and loss, and where you found meaning and purpose in the midst of this grief.
When I lost my husband some time back, and that is when I knew I was in trouble and I needed help. And therefore I sought for help from counseling. I didn't get much help from counseling. In fact, I even enrolled at Amani to learn how I can heal myself. But I didn't find a lot of help then. But then somebody who had come from the US, a grief recovery specialist, found me, and he offered to come and help us as a family with, our grief. And from that time, I learned how I can work through my grief, and I found it so helpful that I decided to make it a career of helping others who are also struggling with grief.
How long were you married, and how long has it been since you lost your husband?
I lost my husband of 33 years, and it was a very difficult time because as many people think, they think when they tell you be strong for the children, they also don't know that you are grieving. So there is no way a griever is going to be strong for somebody else. One of these wrong socializations is when you are taught to be strong, not for yourself, but for others. Then the other socialization is like when we express emotions. You know, when they say be strong, they mean don't show emotion, don't cry. Especially for men, they find it very difficult to cry in public because of the way we are socialized as a society. So they tell you be strong, or don't feel bad, like when you lose something, or not even just a person, but you may lose something and you are told, or a relationship, and you are told don't feel bad, you'll get another one. Or there are many fish in the sea, you see?
So what does that do to you when you're told, yes, and you know it cuts across religions and even cultures, that do not cry,
Yes.
because, from that context, what does it do to a person?
Yes, in many cultures, we are told not to cry because it is thought of as a sign of weakness, because you don't want to be thought to be weak. But I don't know about other religions, but I know even in Christianity, Jesus cried. He did. He wept. When we are told that time will heal, for instance, time does not heal in itself. What heals is what you do over the time.
So how do you know it's beyond normal grief?
Complicated grief is when you find you cannot get that pain out of. Look at the way children grieve. Children are very good grievers. And Wanjiku, they fall down and they wake up, they cry, and then after a short while they are laughing again. That's a way to process, a normal way of processing grief. And also for adults, it could be normal. And I do believe nature has a way of healing those who go through grief. But because of the socialization and the societal expectations that are laid on grievers, we find you can get stuck. As Shirley said, you can easily get stuck. In normal life, people are not perfect. Sometimes we want to create perfect people after they die, whereas we know they were just human. Like if you lose a spouse, for instance, I remember in the case of myself and my husband, we also had those husband-wife moments when we would not talk to each other. But then we also had very good moments together. Now, you need to be able to balance that. If you don't want to get stuck, you need to be able to balance those emotions. And then those who talked earlier on, they talked about undelivered communication. That one can get you stuck.
Is this where forgiveness comes into play?
Forgiveness is very important. Just as Rosa said, there's some undelivered communication that, let's say your spouse was an ex when they died. You think that that person is not feeling pain of the death of a spouse who was probably bad to them? And then they are stuck with that feeling. This person, I know I wronged them or they wronged me, and I did not get time to make it up with them. That is another area where you can get stuck. And therefore, when we are taking people through the grief recovery process, we take them through a forgiveness, what we call a significant emotional statement, where you look at them as they were, where they wronged you, accept that they wronged you, and forgive them.
And what are some of the signs that you see somebody exhibiting that would perhaps benefit from counseling, from seeing a grief coach or a grief recovery specialist?
A lot of Africans are not into counseling, but it is very important. Talk to somebody who can help you. Go for prayers. Prayers also help. So when you feel low, it's okay, accept. That's the way, you know, it goes. But sometimes you feel high. Sometimes you are bargaining, but not in any order. Sometimes you are angry with the people. I have seen people fighting in funerals. That is grief. Yeah. So they start scrambling over properties, small things, because they are angry. And this is because of grief, yeah.
Right. Thank you so much. Grief, loss, words that carry weight heavy as stones, a shadow dark and deep. It visits our dreams in the hours of sleep, a silent companion, a silent thief, stealing moments of joy, leaving traces of grief. Loss is the absence, the void left behind, a fragment of heart, a piece of the mind. It's the chair left empty, the room now still, the echo of laughter, a haunting thrill. Grief is the tear that won't fall, a scream that won't sound, a storm of emotion where words drown. But grief, loss, they're not just pain, they're the proof of love. They're the memories held, the stories told, the hands we held, the hearts of gold. Grief is the process, the healing is slow, the acceptance of change, the letting go. It's the strength to move, though burdened and tired, and though they bring pain, they also reveal the depth of our hearts, the strength we conceal. News Corp.